The Twin Dilemma. During the autumn of 1983, Anthony Stevens' progress on the Twin Dilemma slowed to a crawl. To the mystification of the production team, he began explaining away his problems with increasingly bizarre excuses, most famously a claim that his typewriter had literally exploded. To make matters worse, the Twin Dilemma did not meet the approval of its assigned director, Peter Moffat. Moffat implored Saward to intervene, pointing out a number of issues of both storytelling and logistics. By now, however, Anthony Stevens had fallen badly ill and could not continue working on the serial. In fact, the Twin Dilemma would be his final television credit before his death in 1990. Attack of the Cybermen. The authorship of this serial has long been a bit of a mystery. Eric Saward turned to Ian Levine, who had been acting as an unofficial continuity advisor to the production office for several years. Levine had unsuccessfully proposed several narratives in recent years, and Saward now suggested that they collaborate on a storyline involving the Cybermen. In late 1983, Ian Levine prepared a document entitled Return to Telos. It drew heavily on the Cybermen stories of the 60s, most notably their 1966 debut adventure, The 10th Planet, which was set in 1986 and witnessed the destruction of their home planet Mondas, and 1967's The Tomb of the Cybermen, which established the presence of the hibernating Cybermen on Telos. Other elements, such as the Cybermen hiding in the London sewers, came from 1968's The Invasion. For a time, it was also thought that the Cyber Director from that serial would also be included in the sequences set on Earth. It appears that Eric Saward then augmented Ian Levine's outline with his own inventions, such as the mercenary Lytton, whom he had introduced in the previous year's Resurrection of the Daleks. He also developed the alien Cryons, whom he tried to define as individuals by giving them distinct character traits, rather than attributing monolithic personalities. The notion of the Doctor attempting to repair the TARDIS chameleon circuit came from John Nathan Turner as well. He saw this as an excellent publicity vehicle, since he knew that the press would not be able to resist any innuendo that the Time Machine might be losing its traditional police box form. Given Nathan Turner's edict, there was no question of Saward being credited as the story's scriptwriter. Furthermore, Ian Levine's working relationship with the Doctor Who production office was predicated on the understanding that he would not receive any on-screen acknowledgement. As a result, Eric Saward turned to writer and teacher Paula Woolsey, an ex-girlfriend with whom he was still on good terms. Saward would commission her to provide the scripts, which would be credited to the pseudonym Paula Moore. The true extent of Woolsey's input into the scripts is unclear. Some sources suggest that Eric Saward wrote them in their entirety, and Woolsey's only role was to serve as a figurehead to misled John Nathan Turner. Other sources indicate that Paula Woolsey did write draft scripts, which were then considerably revised by Eric Saward, at least in part because of her lack of experience in television. Eric Saward himself has suggested that he performed no more editing of Woolsey's work than any other set of scripts. In fact, he even claimed that the storyline was largely Woolsey's creation, and that he simply worked with her to incorporate the Cybermen, the Cryons and Lytton. However, fan continuity advisor Ian Levine denies these versions of events, leading it to be a bit of a mystery as to who really wrote Attack of the Cybermen. Vengeance on Barrows. A great challenge for director Ron Jones was finding an actor to play Syl. Philip Martin, the writer, had envisaged the character as floating in a tank of water, but J&T felt that this would be too difficult to realise in the studio, and so it was decided that Syl would actually sit on a platform above his water tank. Nonetheless, a performer of diminutive proportions would be needed for the role, and so Ron Jones unsuccessfully interviewed several short-statured actors. Around the same time, BBC producer Alan Shallcross wrote his colleagues to encourage them to make a greater effort to hire performers with physical disabilities. Shallcross's memo was conveyed to Ron Jones, which led him to audition Nabil Shaban, an actor who was born with osteogenesis imperfecta, known as brittle bone disease, which had resulted in the severe underdevelopment of his legs. Shaban was a huge Doctor Who fan. In the past, he had submitted story ideas called Invasion of the Viridans, and put his name forward to play both the Doctor and the Master. He was intrigued by the prospect of portraying a villain as complex as Syl, however, and he definitely accepted the role. Alan Shallcross wasn't so happy, as he was outraged to learn that his appeal had led to Nabil Shaban being cast as a monster. The Mark of the Rani. Unusually, the original commission to score Mark of the Rani did not go to a member of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, as was J&T's usual policy at the time, but rather to an independent composer named John Lewis. Unfortunately, Lewis fell ill from AIDS-related complications and died in February 1985. By this time, he had composed 32 minutes of music for the Mark of the Rani, but it was decided that his work would not be used. His family was compensated for his efforts all the same. Instead, Jonathan Gibbs of the Radiophonic Workshop was assigned the task of composing a new suite of music for the serial. However, you can still listen to John Lewis's compositions on Part 1 of the DVD and Blu-ray. The Two Doctors. The original location for this story was going to be set in New Orleans, with funding being provided by the BBC's North America distributor, Lionheart. As work on the original title, The Kralon Inheritance, progressed, trouble was brewing. It became clear that Lionheart would not be able to cover the cost of the expedition after all, and on February 15, 1984, J&T wrote to BBC Enterprises, the commercial wing of the BBC, in the hope that they would be interested in making up the shortfall. The final nail in the New Orleans coffin was driven home on April 16th, when the office of Graham MacDonald, the head of drama, informed the Doctor Who production team that no money would be made available for filming in the United States. Working quickly, J&T suggested Venice in Italy as an alternative location, but it was soon determined that the crush of tourists plus the higher associated costs would be prohibitive. Production associate Sue Anstruther then proposed filming in Seville, Spain, where she had holidayed a few years earlier. It was found that this was a feasible venue, as long as the cast and crew voluntarily accepted a cut in the normal rates of pay to cover meals and lodgings. Time Lash. The narrative's central hook was the appearance of a young H.G. Wells, referred to as Herbert until the very end of the story to preserve the surprise of his identity. Wells was a pioneer of science fiction in the 19th century, and writer Glenn McCoy incorporated a number of references to his work. Most obvious were the connection to Wells's 1895 work The Time Machine, the LOI girl Weena suggested Venus' name, the monstrous Morlocks became the Morlocks, and of course the TARDIS itself owed a great debt to the Wells novel. Other inspirations were 1896 The Island of Dr. Moreau, which prompted the hybrid nature of the Borad, and the 1897 novella The Invisible Man, with the Doctor essentially becoming invisible using the Contron crystals. Revelation of the Daleks. Eric Saward decided to draw upon Evelyn Waugh's 1948 satire, The Loved One, as inspiration. An Anglo-American tragedy which was set in the Los Angeles funeral trade, he was entranced by the idea of a story which ruminated upon the treatment of the dead. July 13th, shortly before Saward began his holiday, the scripts for The End of the Road were commissioned. Part of his holiday was then spent on the Greek island of Rhodes, which influenced the development of the scripts in several respects. Most notably, Orsini was inspired by the Knights Hospitaller, who had occupied the island in the 14th and 15th centuries. Several names were also derived from Saward's time in Rhodes. Tassenbeker came from Sambika, a monastery where barren women prayed in the hope of conceiving a child. Kara was suggested by a local potato called the Kara. The planet Nekros itself was derived from the Greek word Nikros, meaning corpse. Other names were adapted from the Loved One as well. Mr. Jobel was taken from Waugh's odious mortician, Mr. Joyboy. Vogel was a porter in the novel, while Bostock was a reference to the unpleasant Mrs. Comstock and her son. Arthur Stengos was partly influenced by cosmetician Amy Thanatagonos, although Saward had also met a ferryboat owner called Stegnos in Rhodes, and on the other hand, Natasha was named after Saward's eldest daughter. Quite a lot of influences there. The Mysterious Planet. Season 23 began tumultuously as the saga of Doctor Who's long-term status continued to play out, both in the public eye and behind the scenes. The BBC's repeated disavowal of rumours about Season 23's reduced episode counts were undermined in July, when a fax which confirmed these details was accidentally sent to the Doctor Who Fan Club of America instead of Lionheart, the company which distributed the programme in the USA and Canada. Nonetheless, it took until December 18, 1985 before the BBC would publicly acknowledge the season's true length. On July 16, former Doctor Who writer and director Terence Dudley, who had most recently scripted The King's Demons, wrote to J&T offering to replace him as producer if he wanted to move on. However, with the BBC unwilling to approve any of J&T's other proposed projects, there was nowhere for him to move on to. Amongst the other grievances, Eric Saward felt that J&T was spending too much time wooing the programme's American fans and was making poor choices in the actors and directors he brought onto Doctor Who. More and more, the script editor was working from home rather than in the production office, and these problems would only get worse as the season progressed. Mind Warp. Unusually, for this story, the studio work was completed first and then the location as opposed to the norm, where it was the other way round. Production wrapped up with location filming on June 15th and 16th at Peacehaven in East Sussex, where the Telescombe Cliffs were the venue for sequences on the Pebble Beach and at the Rock of Sorrows. Unfortunately, on the 16th, it was discovered that a crew member had accidentally noted the times of high and low tide in reverse. As a result, the water became much deeper than anticipated as the day progressed, and Nicola Bryant grew particularly concerned about the battery pack powering her microphone when shooting the scene of the Doctor and Perry arriving on Forest Beta. Director Ron Jones worked quickly to complete the material before the actor's safety was compromised. Terror of the Vervoids. The third segment of the trial season had the most ever-changing writers and storylines rejected. Originally assigned to develop this narrative were David Halliwell and Jack Trevor Story, both veteran writers but newcomers to Doctor Who. Unfortunately, Story struggled mightily with his serial, entitled The Second Coming. Halliwell, on the other hand, progressed quickly on his storyline, Attack from the Mind, only for Eric Saward to become disenchanted with his work. In mid-October, both serials were abandoned, and it was decided that the future segment of the story would now consist of a single 4-part adventure, rather than two-part stories. Recognising that Halliwell and Story's lack of experience on Doctor Who had contributed to their difficulties, the production team approached former script editor Christopher H. Bidmead. Bidmead had most recently contributed 1984's Frontios, although his The Hollows of Time had been a casualty of the BBC's directive to overhaul the original plans for season 23. Bidmead began developing a new adventure called Pinnacotheca. Consignant that he was working to a tight deadline, he corresponded regularly with Saward to ensure that his work was satisfactory. As such, both he and John Nathan Turner were shocked when in early February 1986, Eric Saward pronounced his storyline as boring and unusable. With a new set of scripts now urgently required, Eric Saward contacted Sapphire and Steel creator P.J. Hammond, whose involvement was suggested by the production office's former continuity advisor Ian Levine. Hammond quickly began writing Paradise 5. This time, however, it was JNT who was unhappy with the results, and Hammond's scripts were dropped towards the end of February. Then on March 1st, JNT ran into writers Pip and Jane Baker in a lift at BBC Television Centre in White City, London. The Bakers had written 1985's The Mark of the Rani, and had briefly been tasked with a story entitled Gallifrey for season 23, before it was rendered defunct by the development of the trial storyline. J&T had apparently been trying to contact the Bakers regarding the future segment, but they had only just returned from a lengthy holiday in Spain. J&T explained the situation on the spot, and they agreed to meet with Eric Saward immediately. The script editor was not enthusiastic about working with the Bakers again, but they had a reputation for writing quickly and in budget, so he proposed that they develop a mystery in space, and the result is Terror of the Vervoids. The Ultimate Foe. The final 2 episodes of season 23 are nothing short of unfortunate. The serial's writer Robert Holmes was rushed to hospital around the end of March, where he would lapse into a coma and sadly pass away. Shattered by this development, Eric Saward agreed to take over the unfinished script. However, this new stress exacerbated the ongoing breakdown in the relationship between producer and script editor, and on April 2nd, Eric Saward resigned from Doctor Who. He nonetheless agreed to complete Robert Holmes's work, on the condition that JNT impose no large-scale changes to the storyline. Since the latter stages of episode 13 were still in rough shape, Eric Saward made a number of amendments to better lead into the concluding instalment. J&T, Saward and Holmes had agreed to end the season on such a dramatic cliffhanger in order to provide a memorable conclusion as to what they knew might turn out to be Doctor Who's final season. Inspired by the Sherlock Holmes story, The Final Problem, in which Arthur Conan Doyle attempted to kill off his famed detective by having him plunge into a gorge at the Reichenbach Falls in a struggle with the villainous Professor Moriarty. In mid-May, however, Saward was infuriated to learn that John Nathan Turner was now having misgivings about the downbeat ending. J&T had grown concerned that it would provide the BBC with a tailor-made scenario to cancel Doctor Who outright, and he felt that the viewers who had followed the season for 14 weeks were owed a genuine conclusion to the story. J&T and Saward corresponded in the hope of identifying a compromise which would assuage the producer's objections while still respecting Holmes's original vision. These efforts proved futile, and Saward became concerned that Nathan Turner would go ahead and alter the scripts as he saw fit. Furthermore, he had heard of reports of John Nathan Turner bad-mouthing him to fans, and he was badly shaken by Holmes's death as well. As such, on June the 1st, Saward withdrew his permission for the use of his version of episode 14. He attempted to do the same for the portion of episode 13 which he had written, but the BBC refused this request on the grounds that the work had been performed in Saywood's capacity as a staff script editor. Consequently, the penultimate episode of The Trial of a Time Lord would be the last on which Eric Saywood was credited. Once again, needing a script at very short notice, John Nathan Turner turned to Pip and Jane Baker to write episode 14. And that's all for the Sixth Doctor era. Definitely a tumultuous time. Join me next time when we'll be looking over the Seventh Doctor. Goodbye.